Hey there, I'm Mike Dunn with Gaming Trend, and today we're looking at The White Castle, designed by Llama Dice Games and published by DeVere. Now, this is a very small box. It's very misleading because what I think we have here is one of the best, if not the best, Euro game released this year, and I'm about to tell you why.
First, let's look at the mechanics and gameplay of this tight little mixture of dice placement, worker placement, and engine building, which may or may not surprise you is totally devoid of anything hamburger related. In fact, the setting of the famous Himeji Castle during the feudal era of Japan has very little bearing on the game, providing little beyond a patina of visual elegance.
The framing does work, but some of the theme-based iconography can be a bit to wrap your head around at first.
The central mechanic of the White Castle is dice placement. During the 3 rounds of the game, 3 sets of different colors of dice are rolled and placed on the matching colored bridge in numerical order from lowest to highest.
The amount of dice rolled is determined by the number of players, which guarantees that however many players there are, each one only gets 3 dice to place per round, leaving 3 dice in the bridges at the end of the round. Now, also note that there are only 3 rounds in the game.
Each player action is determined by the color and number on the die placed, and different placements yield different bonuses, costs, worker placement action, or a combination thereof.
There are 3 worker placement actions a die can activate, and each one represents an area of the board and a specific type of worker.
The Gardener action allows a player to place one of their Gardener meeples on one of the 6 randomized garden cards placed near the bridges. This will always cost some amount of food. It'll also trigger an action or grant resources, usually at an additional cost, and most importantly, scores additional points at the end of the game. If the final dice left at the end of the round are left in a space above an occupied garden, that player can activate the garden card's ability again.
Frankly, this didn't happen as often as one might think. After several games of the White Castle at various player counts, it felt like this action was more situational than the other 2, largely due to how expensive placing workers there could be. In games where the random setup elements provided for easy to acquire food and coin, they saw a lot more action because placing gardeners takes a lot of food and coin. If food in particular was hard to come by, though, those gardens were largely left untended. The Cordier action, on the other hand, became a vital part of a winning strategy in every game.
Most of the board is taken up by the 3 levels of the castle and the castle gates, where Cordier meeples start their journey upwards for 2 coins. Additional levels can be traversed for pearls, and the rooms in levels 1 and 2 have cards that can be claimed by the player.
Moving a Cordier into that room lets the player claim its card and putting it into the card area of their player board. Get all the way to the top and you get to trigger a lantern action in addition to one of 3 choices on a card from another deck that is randomly selected during game setup. Each level yields progressively more points at the end of the game, even the gates.
Finally, the Warrior action allows a player to place a Warrior meeple in one of the 3 training yards, costing 2, 3, or 5 iron, respectively. Each of these spots has a randomly selected tile with an ability that gets activated when the warrior is placed there, with the most expensive yard having 2 such tiles.
The utility of these 3 spaces can vary from game to game depending on which ability tiles come out, but the real reason to empty your board of warriors is that they act as multipliers at the end of the game for the number of courtiers in your castle. I found that focusing on the symbiosis of these 2 worker types, warriors and courtiers, lent itself to racking up huge points at the end of the game. All the rest of the dice placement in the game yields resources, moves a player's influence token further up the passage of time track, which determines player turn order for the next round, or triggers a lantern action. Even the player boards have die slots, one for each color, corresponding to the 3 rows of workers on the board, allowing for what is called a personal domain action. As courtiers, warriors, and gardeners are placed on the main board, resource icons are revealed.
When a personal domain action is taken, all of the revealed icons on the row yield the appropriate resources, and the action on the card at the end of the row is taken.
How often this is done each game generally depends on the board state established during setup. So swapping out these cards by moving courtiers up the castle is potentially a game changer. I've already brought it up a few times, hinted at it, so let's talk about one of my favorite parts of the game, the lantern action. There are 2 different ways to trigger the lantern action, and you can trigger it multiple times in a single turn.
The most obvious way to trigger it is by placing a die that corresponds to the action on a card or on the board.
Now, the interesting way to trigger it is by taking a die on the leftmost side of any of the 3 bridges. Now, this often results in a sacrifice of sorts because when you place a die on any of the spots, you either pay or gain the difference between the die and the slot you place on it, and usually that means you're going to have to pay. But it's worth it. Lantern actions are very worth it. Now, at the beginning of the game, this is more like a nice little bonus.
But as you move courtiers up the castle and claim cards, your current personal domain action card flips over and moves down to an ever-growing lantern action, bringing you everything from resources to influence to coins to points.
It's just really nice. Eventually, you hit on that one turn just right, where you end up triggering the lantern 2 or 3 times, and it's like hitting a jackpot. I'm going to let you in on a little secret. Sometimes when reviewing a game, we reviewers will occasionally misread or accidentally omit a rule and play the game incorrectly 1 or more times. Now, this is a problem if the mistakes are never caught, or if the game is never played correctly, but more often than not, it becomes an accidental blessing and underscores and reveals where some of the decision-making involved led to the rules in question. The first 3 or 4 games I played of White Castle, each play had one small omission or misplay, and as I corrected each one with each subsequent play, my opinion of the game went from good to great. When that final rules mistake that I was making got corrected, the quibbles and nitpicks I had, especially with how tight the game was and how badly I wished I could have just 1 or 2 more turns, melted away, and the true balance of the game lay revealed. Now, I wouldn't go so far as to say that the rules for the game are written poorly, but like everything else in this tiny box, they are very dense. It's the capacity of chaining actions like that, and even the possibility of doing so in the early part of the game, where the White Castle really shines. These chain reactions can go deep, and taking a one-and-done action feels like a missed opportunity in a game where each player only gets a total of 9 turns. Conversely, when a single turn has you fiddling with nearly every corner of the game board, the resulting dopamine spike might just remind you why you got into this hobby in the first place. That so much game is packed into such a small box for such a low price is utterly refreshing in these days of cardboard crowdfunding excess. This $30 to $40 box is dense, has to be packed just so, and any thoughts of an organizer or room for an expansion are laughable at best. Component quality, much like the gameplay, presents as a much bigger, more expensive game. Frankly, the whole package may be one of the best values I've seen in this hobby in years, and will likely land in my top 5 games of the year at this point. That's why we're giving the White Castle a 95. A tiny box with a ton of game, the White Castle is a tight yet satisfying midweight worker placement game with a ton of replayability. The combination of dice placement and worker placement and the capacity to kick off chain reactions with wild abandon makes this one of the best games in this class for years. And the small price tag just means there's really no excuse for you to add it to your collection.